Latin America just turned its back on the USA and embraced China in a diplomatic thriller that's leaving everyone speechless.
Over the past 10 years, China has replaced the U.S. as Latin's top trading partner. This means that they basically have greater influence in the Western Hemisphere in some of the most populous areas in this region, to include Brazil, Peru, Colombia, Panama, Venezuela, Cuba, Honduras. The list keeps on growing.
In the last 10 years, they've had at least 5 different meetings to discuss politics, diplomacy, and economic ties. These trips saw ties between the two countries grow even stronger to an all-weather strategic partnership. But Venezuela is just one of the many Latin American countries that China is courting. Even though thousands of kilometers separate them,
we need to pay attention to what's happening in our own backyard, Mexico, Central America, Latin America in general, because especially the Chinese, the Iranians and the Russians in certain countries, but especially the Chinese.
Community leader Miriam Arce's artist studio is on the front line. Dust blankets every surface.
It's hard to have a conversation because it's so noisy.
We're taking a closer look at China's growing economic influence around the world. Our Keir Simmons now with rare access inside a multi-billion-dollar project giving China a foothold in America's backyard.
We are entering into a new phase of the Chinese-Latin America relationship. It's not only trade, it's not only commodities, but also a presence that is becoming very important in technological areas.
Have you ever wondered why Latin America ditched the traditional American sweetheart dance for a new partner in China? Why did they even step onto this geopolitical battleground? It's like watching a telenovela unfold with twists and turns at every corner. And what did the USA do that made Latin America say, adios amigos, and head straight into China's open arms? Yes, Latin American countries like seasoned poker players have suddenly revealed their cards and joined forces with China. It's a plot twist that has everyone talking, but how did the USA manage to fumble its diplomatic play so spectacularly? Well, buckle up, because we're about to dive into the jaw-dropping saga of why Latin America chose China over the USA, and the mind-boggling missteps that led to this geopolitical bombshell. So here's the deal. Imagine 2 kids on a playground. One is the USA and the other is China. Both want to be the most popular kid in the park. For decades, the USA had the biggest, shiniest toys, and everyone wanted to play with them. But recently, China has been showing up with some pretty cool gadgets of its own. Now, all the other kids, in this case, Latin American countries, are paying attention. Over the past 20 years, China has poured over $160 billion into Latin America. That's a lot of money, like buy a small country kind of money. And out of nowhere, 20 Latin American nations joined China's Belt and Road Initiative.
From 2000 to 2010, most Chinese investment in Latin America went into the extractive industries, into mining and oil in South America mostly. The Belt and Road Initiative starts in 2013, and what you start seeing is a lot of loans from Chinese policy banks to governments in the region that are used to hire Chinese contractors to develop infrastructure.
If you're wondering what that is, think of it like China's big plan to build roads, bridges, and other infrastructure all over the world, kind of like setting up superhighways to connect everyone to its massive economy. Now here's the thing, China didn't even see Latin America as a top priority. It was just a side quest in their bigger game plan. But those side quests paid off big time. Meanwhile, back in the USA, some people are getting really worried. Senator Bill Hagerty from Tennessee said, "This is our hemisphere that we're talking about. China is literally eating our lunch."
Thousands of miles from its own borders, China's growing presence in America's hemisphere is visible from this massive construction site. A $3.6 billion deep water megaport that China's President Xi hopes to open in Peru next year. Built by China's Costco Shipping, it's an economic beachhead for Beijing in America's backyard.
Picture that, China munching away on the USA's sandwich. Not a great look, is it? It's like the USA showed up to the playground without any toys at all. So, can the USA step up its game and win back its friends in Latin America? It's going to be a tough match, but let's break it down. First, we'll look at why Latin America is cozying up to China. Then, we'll dive into what the USA has been doing or not doing and what it might need to change. Earlier this year, the United States hosted the Summit of the Americas. Picture it as a big family meeting for all the countries in North, Central, and South America to chat about the big issues facing our part of the world. But surprise, surprise, the USA had another agenda. They really wanted to talk about how to counter China's growing influence in the region. Here's a fun fact. In 2021, trade between China and Latin America hit over $400 billion. That's a huge number. Meanwhile, trade between the USA and Latin America was only about $295 billion. It's like China brought a giant piñata to the party, and the USA just showed up with a small bag of candy.
China became Latin America and the Caribbean's second largest trading partner in 2021, with almost $450 billion worth of goods exchanging hands, up from $12 billion in 2000, almost a 40-fold increase.
Now, before this year's summit even started, there was a big drama. The USA decided to ban Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua from attending. Why? The USA said it's because these countries don't share the same values in democracy. But let's be real, it was a pretty embarrassing and selfish move, and it totally backfired. Think of it this way. Imagine you're hosting a neighborhood barbecue and decide not to invite 3 families because you don't like how they decorate their houses. It's a neighborhood event. Everyone should get an invite. And by excluding these countries, the USA didn't just look bad. It also missed out on a chance to have a real, inclusive discussion. So what happened next? Well, it didn't go down well with the other guests. Many Latin American leaders were upset, and some even chose to skip the summit in protest. It was a bit of a facepalm moment for the USA. Now let's dig deeper. Why are Latin American countries leaning towards China anyway? Well, China has been like that new friend who's always willing to help out, offering loans, building infrastructure, and making big trade deals without asking too many questions. Meanwhile, the USA has been acting like the old friend who's always reminding you of your flaws and making you feel judged. Do you remember when the United States led a diplomatic boycott against the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics? Well, this time some Latin American countries flipped the script and used the same move against the USA. The most vocal critic was Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. He refused to attend the summit in Los Angeles just because the USA decided to ban those 3 countries, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. And he wasn't alone. Leaders from Honduras, Bolivia, El Salvador, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines also said no thanks and followed Mexico's lead. Imagine hosting a huge party and half your guests decide not to show up because they don't like how you're treating some of their friends. That's basically what happened to the USA at this summit. The original idea was to talk about creating a sustainable, resilient, and fair future for everyone. But instead, the summit will mostly be remembered for who wasn't allowed to come and who decided to boycott in protest. This whole situation sent a loud and clear message to the USA. Latin American countries are tired of playing political games at important world meetings. They want everyone to have a seat at the table, and they're not afraid to stand up and say it. There were a lot of speeches made on that summit, and the crowd favorite came from the Prime Minister of Barbados. She looked directly at Secretary of State Antony Blinken and dropped some serious wisdom. She said, "It's wrong that Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua are not here because, as you heard from the Bahamas, we need to speak with those with whom we disagree. We don't only need to narrowcast. That's part of the problem of the world. There's too much narrowcasting instead of broadcasting. There's too much talking at instead of talking with." That's a very powerful speech and one of the most common mistakes the US government makes mistakes in foreign diplomacy. It always wants the world to do things its way, selfishly thinking that whatever is good for America must be good for the world. But every country deserves the right to choose their own form of government, and every country should have the freedom to choose who they do business with. Today, many Latin American countries are willing to trade with China instead of the United States because the U.S. reputation in Latin America is pretty shaky. It has a history of overthrowing elected leaders, installing coup governments, and building U.S. military bases on foreign soil. It's like being the neighborhood bully who wonders why no one wants to play with them anymore. On the other hand, China's approach is more like being the friendly new neighbor who brings over cookies and offers to help fix your fence. According to a recent article from the South China Morning Post, China is everywhere. They're investing in strategic technologies, embedding themselves in 5G networks and other infrastructure, building military alliances, working on political relationships, and jumping into projects early to gain influence. China is like that friend who shows up and says, "Hey, I've got a plan to make things better and I'm willing to invest in it." While the U.S. is often seen as the friend who shows up and says, "Here's how you should do things," without really listening to what the other person wants or needs.
What about the economic impact? Has there been a discernible economic impact for these countries, the ones that decided to join the Belt Road Initiative?
Here's an amazing statistic. Out of the 31 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, 25 have partnered with China to build much-needed infrastructure projects for economic development. That's a lot of countries getting new roads, bridges, and ports courtesy of China. The Summit of the Americas was supposed to be the USA's big chance to show their commitment to the region. But unfortunately for the US, the summit was poorly organized and didn't offer any real tangible benefits for the nations that attended.
Signing into the Belt and Road Initiative is a way of gaining diplomatic favor from China or being on the right side of things with China.
Richard Haass, president of the Council on Foreign Relations, didn't hold back when he said, "The Summit of the Americas looked to be a debacle, a diplomatic own goal. The U.S. has no trade proposal, no immigration policy, and no infrastructure package. Instead, the focus is on who will and will not be there. Unclear is why we even pressed for this to happen." Nicholas Cull, a professor of public diplomacy at the University of Southern California, was even more blunt. "It's freaking amateur hour. It doesn't seem like the United States prepared with image in mind." Now, let's compare this with how China runs its summits. Chinese summits are a whole different ballgame. Another article from the South China Morning Post highlights this difference. The U.S. hosts their summits with the goal of making sure every country respects and embraces America's version of democracy. But let's be real, it's impossible for every country to adopt the American style of governance. In contrast, China comes to the table handing out infrastructure projects that Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and Latin America desperately need to boost their economies. Another major problem for the U.S. government is the lack of money they have to offer at these summits. The U.S. always seems to prioritize projects that support the military-industrial complex. For example, the Biden administration proposed to send $40 billion to Ukraine for more military supplies. The big winner in this deal? America's defense contractors. Meanwhile, at the Summit of the Americas, Biden offered just $617 million for the 31 countries in Latin America. That's less than $20 million per country. To put that in perspective, Biden recently offered $150 million to the 10 countries in the ASEAN alliance. Compare that to China's pledge of $1.5 billion last November to the same region. It's like the U.S. is showing up to a potluck with a bag of chips, while China is bringing a whole feast. So, what's the takeaway here? Latin American countries are increasingly looking to China because China is offering what they need: investment in infrastructure without strings attached. Meanwhile, the U.S. is struggling to provide compelling alternatives and is often caught up in political games. From the outside looking in, it's pretty clear that President Biden's main problem is his administration's inability to offer the kind of economic incentives that would make foreign countries eagerly align with the U.S. Part of the issue is that global liberalism has been heavily discredited by Trump and detested by many American voters. China, on the other hand, has more leverage and a simpler, more straightforward approach. Ultimately, it comes down to a difference in how the US and China operate politically. In the West, economics are important, but as we saw at the summit in Los Angeles, they're often overshadowed by issues like migration, women's rights, inequality, and governance. In China, dissent isn't part of the process. Everyone knows what's expected and they get in line. Jeffrey Moon, a former U.S. consul general in Chengdu, put it this way: in America, these events have an economic dimension, but the political dimension is much more important. The world knows China is a one-party system and will likely remain so, with President Xi Jinping set to rule indefinitely. The U.S., of course, is a two-party state, and the Democrats are expected to lose a lot of power in the upcoming midterm elections. Will the United States elect a Republican president in 2024? These are all critical factors for Latin American countries to consider. Eric Farnsworth, a former State Department official, recently pointed out that Latin America is crying out for economic relief following the pandemic and getting little help from the United States. Meanwhile, China is waiting with an open checkbook. Farnsworth said, "We, the United States, have got to be more proactive. We've got to start offering things that the hemisphere finds attractive." Moving forward, the US and China will continue to battle for more influence in regions around the world. My hope, especially for these smaller developing nations, is that they get the chance to collaborate and partner with both the United States and China. They shouldn't have to choose sides like the naive Americans do in choosing between the Republican and Democratic parties. Instead, they should be able to benefit from the strengths of both countries. What do you think? What do you believe the US can do differently, and China for that matter? Let us know in the comments section below, and don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button below. And to watch the latest geopolitical news, watch this video here.